All right, Shabbos, say good morning, Eschus Baruch Hashem. To be able to learn this incredible daf that is ahead of us today, begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Baruch Meir and Runa Dubin, for dedicating the Shiurim and Joshos this month in honor of their children and all of the suburban sons and daughters beginning their year of study in Eretz Yisrael. May their Torah study amidst us in the Holy Land merit the release of our precious hostages, the success of our soldiers, the return to their families, and the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkinu B'mheira B'yameinu. Amen. Our week of learning sponsors, Shmuel and Shira Artman, in appreciation to the entire community, an outpouring of love and support towards the Links organization. Our Daf Yomi sponsorship for today. I'm going to read it as is. Today's scintillating Daf. Somebody's reading the messaging. Is sponsored by Zevi and Shoshi Daniel in honor of Shmuel Artman and his passionate advocacy on behalf of Links Baltimore. Links provides critical Yom Tov financial assistance, legal help, therapy, as well as many social outlets to families touched by the loss of a parent. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah and Meretz Hashem, the event tonight to support Links should be incredibly successful. They should be able to, Meretz Hashem, provide for children who have suffered this loss so early in life. And Halavai, most of all, should be Zochei Meretz Hashem, to live in a world of Amach Hashem Dimam Ya'akal Panim, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu dries our tears, where again HaKadosh Baruch Hu mends all of the broken hearts. And Halavai, we are Zochei Meretz Hashem to experience wave after wave of beautiful Simcha and Shalom for us, for our families, and for all of Klal Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, a really incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tzadik Aleph 91, and we are picking up Emir Hashem on the bottom of Tzadik Amud Beis. Tzadik Amud Beis, Tan Rabbanon, 3 lines from the bottom. Tan Rabbanon, very interesting Gemara. It's Ein Motziin Peros Me'eretz Yisrael Dvarim Sheish Ben Chayi Nefesh. So if you remember again, just to pick up a little bit on the theme from yesterday, so we were speaking about the concept that one has to be very careful with hoarding produce and doing anything ultimately, again, that could potentially manipulate prices in the marketplace out of fear of ramifications that could have specifically on the poor. So along those same lines, the Gemara says is you can't take out staples from Eretz Yisrael. Can't take out staples. What's the concern? If you begin to export staples from Eretz Yisrael, you're going to limit supply. And if you limit supply, again, demand will remain the same, and that will cause prices to go up. What are examples? This could go on. Yenos, shmanim, uslasos. Wine, oil, and fine flour. Now, obviously, you could export it if there's more than enough stuff for everyone. But Lamaisa, assuming that there's not enough for everyone, you have to be very careful about removing these staples from Eretz Yisrael, lest you come to go ahead and drive up prices. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira matir b'yayin is incredible. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira says, no. You can export wine. Take as much wine out of Eretz Yisrael as you want. Why? Because wine usually tends to get people into trouble. So therefore, again, when people drink, they do all kinds of things that they wouldn't normally do if they weren't drinking. And therefore, again, so diminishing the wine supply in Eretz Yisrael is spiritually beneficial. This way, again, it limits the amount of immoral or light-headed behavior that could be occurring. Fascinating. The same way that you can't take out these staples from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, kach in motziim Eretz Yisrael to Syria. So too, you can't export from Eretz Yisrael to Syria. I must remember, we've seen Syria many times. Syria was an area conquered by David HaMelech, but it wasn't a Milchemes Mitzvah, right? It wasn't a war campaign that was commanded by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was particularly, in other words, this was David HaMelech's own initiative. So in general, there's a tremendous discussion about whether or not Syria has Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Does it have sanctity of the land? So here the Gemara clearly is reflecting the idea that what we call Kibush Yochid, Lo Shmei Kibush. Anything conquered by an individual, not conquered by Eretz Yisrael, not conquered by Am Yisrael, does not have the status of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, again, this prohibition to export staples applies even to Syria. Rabbi Matir, but Rabbi holds that it's mutter, top of Tzadik Aleph 91a, mehefrichya leefrichya, from one border town to another border town. In other words, that if you have, let's say, remember Syria borders Eretz Yisrael. So if you have a border town of Eretz Yisrael, ultimately again, and a border town of Syria, that you could export from one border town to the other border town, because literally again, they're right next to each other. Okay. So the Gemara goes weiter. Furthermore, in Eretz Yisrael, you can't do business with staples. Well, life staples. Now again, we'll see exactly what this means. Kigon, yenos, shmanim, uslasos, like wine, oil, and flour. So these are considered to be the staples for daily life, and therefore again the Gemara says you can't do business with them. Now what does this mean? Now, mistakrin means you can't run a profit on them. What does that mean? Take a look at the Rashbam. In mistakrin, liknos yayin v'shemen uslasos mi balabayis, limkar bashok. Ella balabayis atzmo yimkar litzrichin kmo sheyimkar lechenveni. So I'll say this is very interesting. What does this mean that you shouldn't do business with a profit? What it means is the balabayis, which is the owner of the produce, shouldn't sell this to a middleman, and then the middleman is going to sell it to the consumer. Because why? What happens? Every single time another person gets involved, what occurs? There's a markup. So in other words, instead for when it comes to wine, oil, and flour, what the halach is encouraging is the balabayis should sell directly to the consumer. Cut out the middleman. Cut out the middleman. That way, again, you keep prices low. So again, the Rashbam goes on. He says, "Kmo sheyimkar lechenveni yemil liknos schitim v'lasos pas motor kevan deika tircha sharva limkar hadavar be'en kmo shekona osu balabayis." Aser to habalabayis nami masi mas bin lebilo torach. So obviously, the Rashbam points out over here the reason why you could do this is because these are things that can be sold by the balabayis. So, for example, like in other words, we're not going to cut out the baker, right? Because the baker performs a specific service, right? He takes wheat and he turns it into bread. So that's a tircha. There's effort involved in that, and therefore you can't expect the balabayis who grows the wheat to sell the bread. But lamaisa, when it comes to actually selling the flour, the oil, and the wine, so that the Gemara says, if possible, we tell the balabayis, the person who has these, who grows these items, produces these items, you sell it directly to the consumer, cut out the middleman, keep it. The goal is for staples to keep prices low so that the poor are not cut out. They said about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Shaya mistaker biyayin v'shemen. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah used to do business with wine and oil, which means they both say, now whether that means he was the balabayis and he gave it to a middleman, or that he was the middleman, whatever it is, he did business with wine and oil. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says it's not a kasha. Biyayin savarla k'Rabbi Yehuda. So I both say with wine, he held like Rabbi Yehuda ben Basra. Then again, what did Rabbi Yehuda ben Basra said? Rabbi Yehuda ben Basra said it's good to export wine from Eretz Yisrael. Why is it good to export wine from Eretz Yisrael? Less wine, less trouble. So maybe he felt, you know what, it's okay to drive up the price of wine, even if that limits people's ability to purchase it, because this way, again, maybe you diminish the trouble that people could get themselves into. And b'shem, what about with oil? Basra, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah shchiach mishcha. In Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's locale, oil was abundant. So because oil was abundant, there was a lot of supply. Because there was a lot of supply, therefore, by definition, prices were going to remain low. Incredible. Tanrabanan. In mistakrin pamayim bebeitzim. So we'll say this is very interesting. So literally what it means is, you can't profit twice with eggs. Right? Or you can't do business twice with eggs. What does this mean? Amrim Barmar, Pligi bar Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel had a machlokes as to how to interpret this phrase. Chad Amar, al Chad Trey. One said that when it comes to eggs, you can never charge double the value. Right, so if an egg is worth $1, you can't sell an egg for $2. Okay? The Chad Amar Tagar Latigra. The other opinion said you can't sell from one merchant to another merchant. So there's both say that interestingly, here's what's also fascinating. Eggs are not on the staple list. Eggs are not on the staple list. So therefore, again, by definition, even if I'm an egg farmer, I could sell to a middleman. I can sell to a middleman, he can sell the inventory. What can't I do? I can't go ahead and, if I'm the middleman, I can't sell to another middleman, because obviously every time you sell to a middleman, the price is going up. So even though, again, eggs aren't on the staple list that necessarily need to be strictly price controlled, but at the end of the day, they're still considered essential enough that you will allow one middleman in, but not two middlemen in. Okay, beautiful. Tarabanon. So we'll say first wide line at Tzadik Aleph, Amud Aleph, 91a. 91a. And fine, but if you just take a look at the Rashbam, but it's also just fascinating, just societally, like what's on the staple list and what's not on the staple list. So if you look at the Rashbam, he says bebeitzim nearly mishum debeitzim ein ban chayi nefesh kol kach, right? So eggs are a staple, but not that much of a staple. Not much of a staple. The gam torach meruba v'revach muatu. Furthermore, again, apparently eggs, a lot of effort, and not a lot of profit to be realized there. So by the way, just as an aside, interestingly enough, so apparently, if you notice over here, the laws of Onah apparently don't apply to eggs, right? Because halacha l'maisa, what the Gemara is prohibiting is double charging, right? So if the egg is worth $1, you can't charge $2. That's where the limit is. But interesting enough, or you can sell to one intermediary, not two. Okay, interesting. Tanabanan. Masrina prakmatya vafilu b'Shabbos. So we'll say this is fascinating. Now Masriyan literally means, Rashbam says over here, Masriyan b'tfila, you could daven on Shabbos, al prakmatya shehuzla, habegodim tovim shehuzlu, de'ein kan hefzed la'aniyim im yokiru. So I'll say this, so this is incredible. If there is a diminished, a significant market crisis, right? A significant merchandise crisis where prices are plummeting, and therefore, again, there's you could daven for that, you could call a tefillah gathering, even on Shabbos. Even on Shabbos. So I'll say, this is business. You could do it even on Shabbos, which I will say is such a profound idea. Now, obviously, what they're talking about over here is a significant market crisis. So this is going to impact everyone and going to have dramatic ramifications. You could dive into HaKadosh Baruch Hu for assistance for that, even on Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan was an example of this. Kigon klei pishton beBavel. An example of this would be plummeting prices for linen clothing in Bavel. The yain v'shemen be'eretz Yisrael, or perhaps again inflation, right, and rising prices for wine and oil in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Yosef, v'hu dezal v'kam asara b'shisa, and this would be so. We'll say. So, what's the example of this? The example of this would be in the clothing case. Let's say again, the clothing became so inexpensive that you could buy 10 articles of clothing for 6 coins or for 6 zuz. The idea of 6 dinar. The idea is that the prices plummeted in such a significance. So, we'll say, what's the idea? The idea over here is that you're allowed to daven for financial crisis on Shabbos. Now again, you have to, this is not, you check your stocks, on Friday, you're not happy with how they're doing, so you decide to gather 10 of your friends and start davening for your portfolio on Shabbos. No, that's not what we're talking about over here, right? But Lamaisa, you see from here that a financial issue that affects the community, you can daven for that on Shabbos, which is quite interesting. Tan Rabbanon. So I'll say this is incredible. Ein yotzin me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, this, remember again, in general, there's a whole discussion in Maseches Ksuvos about when and if one is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Right? Obviously, again, Eretz Yisrael is the epicenter of our spiritual activity. Eretz Yisrael is our ancestral homeland. So it's one thing if I'm not there, right? So then ultimately, again, the obligation to go there. If I am there, under what circumstances am I permitted to leave? So Tanabanan in Yotzim Eretz Yisrael Ela Imkein Amdu Sasayim Besela. So we'll say, so first opinion of the Brisa says, if it just becomes too expensive to live in Eretz Yisrael. So if I'm living in Eretz Yisrael, and ultimately again, it becomes so expensive to purchase items, to purchase food, that two sa'ah of grain or food are sold for a selah, that represents that food is very expensive. That halacha l'maisa, again, then you could leave. By the way, I just want to point out an incredible Rashbam. What's the problem with leaving Eretz Yisrael? If I leave Eretz Yisrael, I could leave Eretz Yisrael. The Rashbam says, Ein yotzin shemafkia atzmo min ha-mitzvos. when you leave Eretz Yisrael, you are preventing yourself from performing mitzvos. So this could be understood on one of two levels. First of all, on the most basic level, there are mitzvos hataluyos ba'aretz, right? Obviously, there are certain mitzvos you could only perform in Eretz Yisrael. So remember again, in Eretz Yisrael, every single time you eat produce, there's trumas and maestros, right? There's shmita. There are so many, right? There's leket, shicha, chapeya, right? There's all of these mitzvos that are taluyos ba'aretz. And the Beis Hamikdash stood, of course, a whole other set of mitzvos. Remember, there's also another school of thought. The other school of thought is, in general, conceptually, mitzvos really only apply in Eretz Yisrael. All mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. So why do we perform mitzvos in Chutz La'aretz? And the answer is practice, right? Practice when Mashiach comes, and in Eretz Hashem, we go back to Eretz Yisrael, which of course is an overwhelming thing to think about, an overwhelming thing, and theologically troubling as well, that all we're doing is practicing. Again, not everybody subscribes to that school of thought, so I just want to point out that when the Rashbam says over here that the problem with leaving Eretz Yisrael is that you're absolving yourself, so to speak, from mitzvos. Again, it can be understood in one of two ways. The specific agricultural mitzvos depend on Eretz Yisrael, or maybe, according to one school of thought, all mitzvos. All mitzvos. You're going from a place where you're really obligated to a place where you're just practicing. Again, more about that. So the Gemara says, so therefore, the only reason you could leave is simply if it becomes financially unbearable. Right? Again, it's so expensive in Eretz that I can't afford to support myself. Rabbi Shimon, a Masai. When is this so? When is this so? So I said, by the way, and this would be in line with the Gemara that brings down that one is permitted to leave Eretz Yisrael for the purpose of parnasa. So again, if it becomes so expensive that I can't live in Eretz Yisrael, then okay, I'm permitted to leave. When is that? That's only if really there's no produce available to buy. But if there is produce available, if there's food available, so I said this is very interesting. So Rabbi Shimon comes on, Rabbi Shimon argues on this. He says, no. When can you leave Eretz Yisrael? When there's food scarcity. There's food scarcity, okay? You can't find food, famine, you can leave Eretz Yisrael. But if it's a question that it's expensive, you can't leave because of expense. You can't leave because of financial issues. Ashbi said, this is incredible. So Ashbi said, Omer, Elimelech machlon v'kilyon, gedoli hador hayu. So we'll say, Elimelech machlon v'kilyon. Rus's husband and Rus's sons. They were gedoli hadar. They were Gedolei Hadar. Uparnase Hadar Hayu. And they were the people, the leaders of the generation. So we'll say, in other words, it's fascinating how there could be a difference between a Gadol Hadar and a Parnes Hadar. Somebody could be the greatest Torah scholar in the generation. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're a leader, right? Leadership and scholarship don't necessarily go together. Often they do, but sometimes they don't. It's interesting to point out over here how Elimelech Machlon and Kilyon, the Gemara says, Gedolei Hadar, they're great Talmidei Chachamim, Uparnase Hadar, they were leaders. They were leaders and supporters of the generation. So ultimately, again, why were they punished? In other words, mostly because they all die in the beginning of Megillah. Why did they die? Rabbi say this is dramatic. Why did they die? They died because they left Eretz Yisrael. They died because they committed the Aveira of leaving Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz Shnei Amar, Vatom Kol Ha'ir Alein Vatomarna, Hazos Naomi. So we'll say, so this is talking about at the end of the first chapter of Megillas Rus. After Elimelech, Rus's husband died, Machlon and Kilyon died. Remember again, Rus and Arpa began the journey back with, Rus and Arpa began the journey back with Naomi. So Arpa goes back, Naomi continues forward. So Naomi and Rus walk into Beis Lechem. And in that moment they walk into Beis Lechem, the entire city is like in an uproar. Vatam Kol Ha'ir, everybody was astonished in wonderment. And they said, Hazos Naomi, is that Naomi? So the Gemara said, my Hazos, what does that mean, is this Naomi? Rabbi Yitzchak, Amru Chazisem Naomi Sheyatsa Sa Me'eretz L'chutz La'aretz Ma'al Salah. The people said, look at Naomi. Naomi left Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz La'aretz, and look what happened to her. Look what happened to her. Now, I will say, I just want to show you just a fascinating progression in this Gemara, right? So remember again, the Gemara started by saying, the Brisa started by saying that if food becomes too expensive in Eretz Yisrael, you're allowed to leave. You're allowed to leave. Rashbi comes along and Rashbi says, no. You could leave because of famine. But as long as there is food to be found, you are not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. And he brings the story of Rus because he attributes the death of Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilyon to the sin of the Eretz Yisrael. It's just fascinating that it's Rashbi. And again, I will say, Rabbi Shmuel Silber hid in a cave, right? And survived on water and Basra, water and carobs. So Rabbi Shmuel Silber, it's incredible. Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, you don't leave Eretz Yisrael if you could find something to eat. As long as there is something, there's water, there's Basra, there's something you can, then the Eretz Yisrael provides life by itself. So as long as you could find your basic level of sustenance, Rashbi says, don't leave. It's just sometimes fascinating when you understand who says a particular statement and you understand their life circumstances, it informs their thinking. Rashbi's coming, Rashbi says, leave Eretz Yisrael because food becomes expensive. No, as long as there is something to eat, you stay. That's Shitas Rashbi, because that's the way Rashbi lived his life. Incredible. Rabbi Yitzchak, Osa Hayom Shebasar Osam Avil Eretz Yisrael. We'll say incredible Gemara over here. That day that Rus came to Eretz Yisrael, Meisa Ishto Shel Boaz. So that's an incredible Gemara. So remember again, the Gemara says over here that the day that Rus came back. So remember again, Rus leaves. She left with her husband Elimelech, her sons Machlon and Kilyon. They went to Moab. We'll discuss more about that in just a second. Machlon and Kilyon married Moabite girls, Rus and Arpa. Now Naomi loses everything. She comes back. On the day that she came back, Boaz's wife died. Right, Boaz, we know the story. I don't want to ruin the end for you, right? But remember again, Boaz marries Rus. On the day that Rus came back, Boaz's wife died. This is what people say, the famous adage, Adelo shachiv shichra kaima mano beise. So the famous adage goes, before a person dies, their replacement is already there. The replacement is already there. So literally, take a look at Rashbam. The Rashbam says, before a person passes away, so essentially, before you die, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has already created your replacement. Now, this adage has many different meanings to it. On one hand, it shows us the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that often the most tragic part of death is the void that is left. Understand, in the way that the Ribono Shel Olam runs his world, is that before someone leaves this world, and every person when they leaves a void, HaKadosh Baruch Hu already creates that which is going to fill the void. That's already there. It doesn't necessarily fill the void the same way. Certainly, again, from the person experiencing the loss, the void is not filled the same way. But on the cosmic level, the Ribono Shel Olam never allows the world to remain deficient. So there's loss. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes in and fills in the loss even before the loss occurred. Now let's say on a humility level, it's also very humbling. We often think that we're irreplaceable, right? And we often think that no one could ever do what I do. I'll say one of the most humbling things in the world is everyone is replaceable. Everyone is replaceable in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not the same. And this will say is so important. So often we give so much time to our careers, right? And Baruch Hashem, we have to make a parnasa. But often what we do is, if you think about it, we tend to give so much more to our employees or to our co-workers or to our companies than we even give to our families. We'll say the most humbling thing is, if you die, your position will be filled pretty quickly. Like, in other words, there's not going to be a long-term vacancy for your position. Whatever you're doing, however important it is, and whatever it is, a lawyer, doctor, rabbi, whatever you do, there's not going to be a vacancy for that long, right? They'll hold a nice memorial in the office, right? Everybody will come, they'll come together, they'll take your supplies, and then Hashem, and then pretty much afterwards, life will go on, and before you know it, no one will even remember. Your family will always remember, right? Because we know this, when there's a loss in a family, there's always that hole. Even if HaKadosh Baruch Hu somehow fills the void is never really filled in a family. And it's incredible, right? It's really incredible. In your office, in your career, whatever void you leave, give it a week. Give it a week, 2 weeks, a month if you're a real superstar. And then Amirat Hashem, it'll be filled. It'll be filled. Just important, especially as we close out the year, go into the new year, and want to figure out how to reorganize our priorities. Really to figure out where we should be focusing, where we should be putting our time, and when we leave this world, where and by whom we will really be missed. So the Gemara goes by to Amarav Barafuna. Amarav, if son Ze Boaz. What's this? Very interesting. The shofet, the judge known as Ivtson, who's one of the judges, is actually Boaz. It's actually Boaz. The Gemara says, okay, my Kamashlan. So what is the Gemara teaching us? Ki idach to Rabbi Barafuna. Like this was like Rabbi Barafuna. What did Rabbi Barafuna say? The Amarav Barafuna, Amarav. It was an incredible Gemara. Mea ve'esim mishtaos asal Boaz lebanav. Boaz made 120 feasts for his children. 120 parties for his kids. Listen to this, we'll say wedding feast we're talking about over here. Shenemar, vahi lo shloshim banim ushloshim banos. It's incredible. If son had 30 sons and 30 daughters. Now, I will say now, it's quite possible whenever you see such exact numbers like that, it's possible that they are hyperbolic. But the point over here is, clearly had more than one wife, and he had again multiple kids. A lot of children, a lot of sons, a lot of daughters. So what happens? The Gemara says, Shalosh shloshim banim, ushloshim banos shalach achutza. So literally, he had 30 sons and 30 daughters that he sent away. Sent away is a reference to getting married. Getting married, okay. Ushloshim banos hevi lebana, and 30 daughters-in-law he brought for his sons. So he had Knei Nahara, 60 kids, 30 sons, 30 daughters, and Knei Nahara, he married them all off. The Gemara says, listen to this. Minachutz vayishpot es Yisrael sheva shanim. So, and if son judged Klal, he was a shofet for 7 years. So also the Gemara is suggesting now that if son, who is mentioned in Sefer Shoftim, is actually Boaz. Now watch this. Now Ivtson made a wedding party for each of his kids. He made 2 wedding parties for each kid. One in his house and one at the in-laws' house. 2 parties for each kid. So the Gemara says, so Ubekulon, listen to this, Ubekulon lo zimein es manoach. I will say, by the way, it's also just incredible to see potentially like who's contemporaries over here. To all of these 120 feasts, he never invited Manoach. Who's Manoach? Manoach is the father, will become the father of Shimshon. So he didn't invite Manoach to any of these sudos. Why? Amar kudno akara b'mai parali. So I'll say, so what happened? Because he said, this sterile mule, how will he ever reciprocate? So it was incredible. So if son Boaz said, Manoach has no kids. So therefore, again, why should I invite him to my chasana? He's never going to invite me. He's never going to reciprocate to inviting me to one of his kids' chasanas. So he never invited Manoach. 120 feasts, and never once invited Manoach. V'kulan meisu b'chayev. All of Ivtson's children died. So Ivtson suffered overwhelming setback by seeing the loss of all of his children. So I'll say, so now just so you appreciate who Boaz was, right? See, he was a shofet. Baruch Hashem had this beautiful life. All of these children, all of these chazanos, all of these parties. Again, was there a character flaw? Sounds like he's a human being. So there's a character flaw by everyone. We all have our character flaws. He loses everything. Now, I say, so just understand, he loses everything, not only his children, but now, fast forward to Megillas Rus, and Megillas Rus, in the beginning of Megillas Rus, we see he loses his wife, right? That's the day. So just link all the stories together. The day that Naomi came back from Moab, Boaz was burying his wife. So now Boaz is all alone in this world when Rus comes back. Now I will say, just so you understand the power and profundity of the story, so then what happens? We know that Megillas Rus, Boaz marries Rus, and they have a child. So Boaz dies not long after marrying Rus. He was much older than Rus. So Boaz has one more child. So the Gemara says, and of course that child, right? That child ultimately again is Oved, Yishai, right? David, right? So ultimately again that child becomes the grandfather of Boaz, was the great grandfather of David HaMelech. So his son was the grandfather of David HaMelech. Incredible. And I will say, the profundity of this story is, Even if you had 60 kids during your lifetime, if they all pass away during your lifetime, so to speak, what good does it do you? What future do you have? Go forward and have one child who will become incredibly accomplished, and that will be your legacy. So Rabbi say this Gemara, if you look at the Rashbam, this is incredible. If you look at the Rashbam says over here, Kidirava Barafuna. The Rashbam says, and this is actually very, very moving. The Ka'amar, Shekalbanav Shal Ifsan Meisu B'chayev, Umid the Ka'amar Ifsan Zeboaz, the Kasa Babash Nasarus, V'afapi Shayla Adayin Banim Harbe Ashmoinon, Shem Nasa Adam Isha B'bacharuso, Yisa Isha B'ziknuso, Kimosha Asa Ifsan. So I will say, this, the Rashbam over here quotes the Gemara Mesachas Yevamis. If this Gemara sounds familiar, this is the Rabbi Akiva Gemara, right? The Rabbi Akiva Gemara in Yevamis that says, quotes over here, Baboker Zara es Zarecha, Uba'erev al Tanach Yadecha. In the morning, sow your fields, and in the evening, literally don't withdraw your hands. In other words, even if you've planted your fields in the morning, keep planting, keep planting, keep planting. The Gemara then goes on to the story of Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva spent all of these years going ahead and cultivating and creating these 24,000 Talmidim, and all of them died. All of them died. So Rabbi Akiva planted, and everything he planted was destroyed. And what did Rabbi Akiva do? He got up and he planted some more. He created 5 more students. And from those students, ultimately, again, Klal Yisrael was rebuilt. So apparently, If's son Boaz also lived this type of life. Finish up the Rashbam. Therefore, the Gemara Mesachas Yevamos says, if a person married when he was young, right, he should marry when he got older. What does that mean? That if a person married when he was young and had a family, and unfortunately his family didn't survive, he should go ahead and marry again and try to rebuild. Kemosha Asa if Sadahinu Boaz. Lefi Shar Yare Shema Yamusu Banav Meishto Rishon B'chayav V'lo Yelo Zachar Uksiba Boker Zara Zaracha LaErev Al Tanach Yadecha. The Mehachin Nami Darshin Alei Kid Mefarish Krat Taima Ki Ein Chayodea Eza Yikasher Aval Ilo Amar Lachaswasei. So again, so that's the idea over here. So this is really incredible. So this is Ifsan Rabbi Akiva. You see these incredible people who, even though they suffer startling and overwhelming setback, ultimately, again, don't give up. So I will say there are 2 dramatic lessons to be taken from this. So number one, on the most basic level, is don't give up. Don't give up. Rabbi Akiva, Boaz slash Ifsan, same person, Boaz, right? So life took such a dramatic, terrible turn for them. They lost everything. Such loss could easily and understandably be completely and profoundly overwhelming. Yet the inner strength of these individuals, I will say, and Klal Yisrael is filled with Rabbi Akivas and Boazes who suffer staggering loss and yet find the strength to move forward. That is the koach of Klal Yisrael that you see come out in the dramatic stories of these individuals. Don't give up. No matter what life takes from you, no matter how terrible or overwhelming or staggering the loss may be, you have to find the koach from within to move forward. That's lesson 1. Lesson 2 I say is incredible. If you look at Lashon of the Gemara over here, the Gemara says, if you have 60 children, what good are they if they all die? So therefore the Gemara says, what should you do? Go ahead and continue to have one child, and that one child may be your future. We'll say it's a incredible metaphor for life. The reality is, I think as we get older, we recognize this, and it's probably one of the most difficult life lessons to internalize. More times than not in life, you fail. That's the way it works in life, right? 60 things that you do don't work, but one thing will. See, the challenge in life is that we want success, and we want it immediately. I find this, by the way, I feel like an old man saying this, in the young generation, right? I always find it amazing, like, every young guy is poised to become a real estate tycoon, right? He's going to go ahead, like, I'm ready, I'm good, this is me. Like, of course, it's easy. I'm a millionaire. I'm going to be a millionaire. How about everybody should be a millionaire? Klal should be filled with millionaires. But understand the way it works. So do you have people who are successful out of the gate? You do. There are people like that, but they are the exceptions and not the rule. The rule is, get ready to fail 60 times for every one success. The challenge in life is, Most people give up, usually, like after the 5th failure. 5 failures, I'm an Eisvar, 5 failures, that's it, I'm a failure, what else there? So they give up. They give up and they just settle for some type of mediocrity. The Gemara says, you gotta be ready to fail 60 times before you realize that one success. That is the way that life works. It's what happened for Boaz, it's what happened for Rabbi Akiva, and we would not be. Do you understand? I just want to point out, do you understand? Had Boaz given up, which would have made so much sense, had Boaz given up, what would have happened if Boaz given up? What would have happened? What would have happened? No David HaMelech. No David HaMelech. But right, 60 kids he lost. He lost the life. He lost the life. And Mamish again, he could have so easily, and no one would have faulted him for going into the room, closing the door, shutting off the light, and giving up on life. But he didn't. And because he didn't, we have a David HaMelech. Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva could have so easily given up. What would we be without Rabbi Akiva? We'd be a shell of a person. And I both say, it's the same thing in our own lives as well. We suffer defeat, and sometimes that defeat stings, and sometimes it hurts, and sometimes it bites. We have to find the koach to continue forward. Whether this is true in our ruchnius or it's true in our gashmius, success is almost always preceded by 60 failures. If it's not 60, it's 5, and if it's not 5, it's 100. Whatever it is, that's the way it works. Failure doesn't mean, here's the yesod. When you fail, it doesn't mean you are a failure. Right? When you fail, it just means that you are one step closer to success. That's the way life works. We just have to be willing to have the staying power to really stay in it and go forward. Incredible, incredible Gemaras. Let's go weiter. Skip the parentheses, saved us a whole bunch of time there. Amrav Chanan Barava, Amarav, Elimelech v'Salmon uploni Amoni, v'Avi Naaman, kulum eleinachshav Aminadav. So let's say, these Gemaras are also great, because often as you go through Gemaras, you don't necessarily, or in general, so Tanakh, you have a timeline, right? Tanakh, you have a timeline, but in Gemaras, you really have no idea, who. So the fact that we just learned before, just like I'm still shocked by it. The fact that we just learned before that Boaz and Manoach were contemporaries. I never knew that. Maybe if I learned Navi, I'd know that. But I'm saying, that's fascinating, right? Which means also that Boaz and Shimshon, right? In other words, that there's overlap over here between these great people. So the Gemara just points out another some more interesting family tree dynamics over here. Elimelech, Salmon, Ploni Almoni, the father of Naami. All of these people are descendants of, or children of Bnei Nachshon and Aminadav. Right? Descendant of Nachshon and Aminadav. So Gemara says, okay, so that's fine. So now I know the family tree, but what's the significance of it? Shafilu mishiyish lo schos avos eino omedes lo b'shah shiyotze me'aretz l'chutz la'aretz. Wow. So kind of looping back, before they were talking about the severity of leaving the land of Israel. So what does it come to teach us? That even if you have schus avos, which means, right, even if you have merits from your ancestors, from your forefathers, they will not save you if you commit the avera of leaving Eretz Yisrael. That leaving Eretz Yisrael is such a profound avera that even if you have schus avos, it won't save you. Incredible. We'll say, get ready for this Gemara. This is incredible. Ime da Avram. What was Avram Avinu's mother's name? What was his mother's name? The Gemara says, I'll tell you. Amasloi bas Carnival. Her name was Amasloi, right? The daughter of Carnival. Ime da Haman. Whose mother was Haman? What was her name? Amasloi bas Orvasi. So Haman's mother and Avram's mother had the same name. They're both named Amasloi. Amasloi, Bas Orvasi, V'Simonech. And also say, how do you remember which one is Haman's mother, which one is Avram's mother? Tame, tar. So it's like Carnival that Ashpan points out means sheep, or fattened sheep. I don't think that's what her name was, but that's what the name represents, fattened sheep, versus Orvasi is a raven. So it's interesting, how can you remember it? So Avram's mother, her name represents a kosher animal, and Haman's mother, her name represents non-kosher animal. So that's the way you remember it. So I'll just point out over something amazing. It's just, all these Gemaras are so incredible. What does it mean that Avram's mother and Haman's mother had the same name? So I'll say, this is a profound yesod. What that means is, I'll say, at the end of the day, does your family have an impact on you? Does your family have an impact on you? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, you can't blame your family for who you are. Right? You could blame your family for a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, who you are and who you want to become, that's up to you. Haman and Avraham have mothers with the same name. Perhaps that's the way of Chazal telling us. A lot of times you don't choose the family. Well, not a lot of times. You never choose the family that you're born into. And sometimes there's dysfunction. Sometimes there's relationship dysfunction. Sometimes there's spiritual dysfunction. Sometimes there's a whole bunch of stuff. Certainly Avram Avinu did not grow up in a Pashut home, right? His father was a major idolater. His father handed him over to the authorities to be executed. You want to talk about, difficult father-son dynamics. Like, that's it. I don't know, was his mother involved in this, not involved in this, who knows? But it wasn't Pashut. It wasn't Pashut for Avram Avinu. So it's true. Sometimes we grow up and we have a lot of baggage from the homes and the families that we grew up in, but you choose who to be. You can't blame your family forever. At a certain point in time, you choose who you want to be, what you want to be, the kind of personality you want to develop. Avram and Haman come from the same as Rabbi. That's why, interestingly enough, if you look at the name Amasloi, so Amasloi, if you look at that word, in that word is an amasla. What's an amasla? An excuse. An excuse. It's incredible, right? So an amasla, there's a better word for excuse. We'll use excuse. And amasla is an excuse. So isn't it incredible that a lot of times people grow up and they have difficulties in their family, and growing up in a dysfunctional or difficult home is the greatest excuse for non-performance. Haman used it. Haman used it not to become a good guy. Haman used it ultimately, again, just to become pure evil. Avram said, you can't use your family as an excuse, as a crutch. You got to decide who you want to be and what you want to be in life. Incredible. Samar goes weiter. Ima de David, who was David HaMelech's mother? So Natseves bas Adal Shma Ime. Right, Shma. So Natseves bas Adal, that was her name. Ime de Shimshon, who was Shimshon's mother. So remember again, it's fascinating. Remember, none of these names are recorded in Tanakh. Right, this is the only place we know this information, this Gemara. Who was Shimshon's mother? Now remember again, interestingly enough, in the Shimshon story, we know his father. His father was Manoach. Right? And in the story in Navi, all it calls his mother is Eshes Manoach, Mrs. Manoach. Who is his mother? Tzalalphonis. Tzalalphonis was her name. Va'achse, who was Shimshon's sister, Nashyan. Okay, Lamai Nafkamina. So the Gemara says, why do we need all of this information? L'tshuvas haminim. Ultimately, again, to go and answer up the apikarsim. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. The Rashbam, 4 lines of the L'tshuvas haminim. Sheshon l'lonu yoser be'ilu minoshim acheros. Kideprishas. So again, a lot of times, people want to chip away at the authenticity of the Torah by telling us that these people didn't exist, because you see, we don't even know who their mothers were. Chazal say we do know who their mothers were. This is who their mothers were. Now again, why their names aren't included in Tanakh, I don't know. Right? But Lamais, again, these are the mothers of Avraham, of David, of Shimshon, of Haman. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Amrav Chanan Barav Amrav, Aser Shanim Nechbash Avram Avinu. So we'll say Avram Avinu remained in hiding for 10 years. Now both say, why was he, not hiding, incarcerated. Right? He was incarcerated. Why was he incarcerated? Take a look at the Rashbam. Nechbash, Shechavshu Nimrod Ubagadar Isi Deterach Aviv Chavsho Bishil Shahayim Abeit Slamav. So both say, so this goes back to what I was saying, we're going to talk about difficult families. So remember again, Terach, Avram's father, handed him over to Nimrod. So Avram Avinu was incarcerated for 10 years. The Rashbam gives 2 gersos. Either he was held captive by Nimrod for 10 years, or he was held captive by his father for 10 years. Okay, either way, Avram Avinu was incarcerated for 10 years. Shalosh bekusa v'sheva bekardo. 3 years in Kusa, these are places, and 7 in Kardo. Rav Dir min Arda masni ipcha. Rav Dir min Arda is just the opposite. 7 years in Kusa and 3 years in Kardo. Okay, I'm Rav Chista. Ivra zeira de Kusa zeu ur kastin. So we'll say that phrase, Ivra Zeir Dekusa, so this is the name, right? Is or Kastim. Suppose this is such a beautiful Gemara. That day when Avram Avinu died, Amdu Kol Gidole Umos Ha'olam B'Shura. So we'll say this is beautiful. The day that Avram Avinu died, all of the great leaders of all the nations of the world stood in a line. Va'amru. Oy lo li olam sha'avad amabeis sha'avad manhigo. This is beautiful. Woe to the world who lost its leader. who lost this leader. So you hear this? Woe to the world who lost this leader. Va'aylo l'sina sha'avad karinta. And woe to the ship that lost its captain. Right? So Rabbi said this is like the captain, right? This is like the woe to the ship that lost its captain. So Rabbi said, first I just want to point out how incredible this is. So what's fascinating to note about this is, when did the world recognize the greatness of Avraham Avinu? When did it recognize his greatness? When he died. It's really fascinating that this is the dynamic of great people, that for whatever the reason, human nature is, we don't appreciate the full profundity and greatness of people while they are alive, only once they die. This is Moshe Rabbeinu, this is Avraham Avinu. So, but when he dies, understand the dramatic kavod. The world leaders said, we have lost our leader. Woe to a world without its spiritual leader. Woe to a ship without its captain. So beautiful and so moving. So now the Gemara goes, a little bit of a change in topic over here. So quoting from Divrei Yomi, which means that literally he causes the elevation to every position of prominence, which means that a person, the Gemara says, so we'll say any position of leadership is only granted by a Kadosh Baruch Hu. If the Ribono Shel Olam doesn't want you to be a leader, you're not going to become a leader. Which I will say is very important to us, because what this means is leadership is a gift and responsibility from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbe only gives it to someone if he believes that they could do something with it. Sometimes there's something good, sometimes there's something bad. But right, it's divinely ordained. To the point the Gemara says, even the guy in charge of the irrigation ditch, the Rashi says, Reish Kargusa, Sar Hamemuna al Aboros, Miyidla Mimeno Hayom Lahashko Sadosav, Umila Achar Usrora Kitanahi. So I'll say the idea over here is even the guy in charge of the well, right? So the guy in charge of the well, what does he decide? He decides who's siphoning off water on Tuesday, who's siphoning off water on Wednesday, on Monday, on Sunday. He's in charge of that. Even that guy, which is it's leadership, but it's a relatively, what we'd call like unimportant position of leadership. Even that is ordained by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I will say, of course, this is incredibly important for us to recognize, especially again in the contentious election season that we are in the middle of. We get so afraid. There's a lot to fear. There's definitely a lot to fear, whatever way this whole thing turns out. But the Nechama Rabbi say is, it's not voters that determine elections. Right? In other words, we each of us has an obligation, a sacred obligation to vote, and we must exercise that right and that gift. And I will say, it's not voters who determine elections. It's the Ribono Shel Olam who determines elections. No leader, the Gemara says, even the leadership of the irrigation ditch only gets decided by God. All the more so, the leader of the free world is going to be selected by the Ribono Shel Olam. And if it's selected by the Ribono Shel Olam, then that means it's part of the plan. And if it's part of the plan, that means it's Gamzu Latova. And if it's Gamzu Latova, then Rabbi say again, we can rest assured that the Ribono Shel Olam loves us so much, is always taking care of us. It's incredibly important. Again, of course, we should do our part, we should do our voting, if you whatever you feel passionately about, do all that stuff. But at the end of the day, leadership, and especially dramatic leadership, is only decided by HaKadosh Baruch Hu at the end of the day. Give us a tremendous nechama in the midst of a sea of tremendous uncertainty. Amrav Chia bar Avin, Amrav Yoshua ben Karcha. Chas v'shalom. So we'll say, so now we're looping back a little bit. Remember, we said before that you can't leave Eretz Yisrael unless, of course, there's no food. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chia bar Avin, Amar Yoshua ben Karcha, Chas v'shalom shafilu matzah subin lo yatsu. So we'll say, so now actually we're going back to the Rus story. So beforehand, the Gemara wanted to suggest, Rashbi suggested, that the reason why Elimelech, Machlon and Kilyon died was because they left Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, Chas v'shalom, afilu matzah subin lo yatsu. Even if all there was to eat was bran, they wouldn't have left. So why were Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilyon? Why were they punished? It's very profound, because they should have davened for their generation, but they failed to do so. As the leaders of the generation, they saw that the generation was in distress. There was regional famine. There was tremendous famine in Eretz Yisrael. They should have davened for the members of their generation, but they did not do so. And as a result of that, they died. Shene'emar, bezakecha yatzilucha kivitzucha. So literally, again, when people gather and they cry out, ultimately, again, that will result in salvation. So I will say, so this is really a tremendous idea. What was the fault of Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilion? As leaders, they had a responsibility to daven for the collective. And when you don't feel the pain of the collective enough to be motivated to daven for them, to be motivated to do for them, then I will say that is sinful in and of itself. And I will say what a profound lesson as well. You know, the danger of being almost a year into this war is we become a little bit dull and insensitive to it. Now, it's just a fact of life. Just like we could say that there are Jewish hostages without breaking down in tears. Right? Almost a year ago, if we were to say that sentence, it would defy comprehension. Now, it's a fact. Now it's a reality. And because of that, we could even do it just like dispassionately. And of course, that's human nature. That's human nature. We have to be so careful not to let down our spiritual guard and to continue to daven for our people, to continue to daven for our hostages, to continue to daven for our soldiers, to continue to daven for Eretz Yisrael. Am Yisrael is in peril. There's danger. There's active danger. Just again today, before noon, 100 missiles launched by Hezbollah. 100 missiles. These are not like stam, like these, Nebesha missiles that they were launching, from Gaza. This is serious stuff. This is serious stuff. So there's danger. There's active danger. And we have to daven and we have to pull out all the spiritual stops from our own. And because if we fail to do so, then again we see the culpability. There's culpability for not davening for your people. Incredible. So furthermore, when did we learn? We only were speaking about again where money is cheap, but produce is expensive. So we'll say, so in other words, if essentially there's money to buy produce, but produce is very expensive, okay, so you can't leave Eretz Yisrael. Aval mos biyoker, afilu amdu arba sin besela yotzin. Now we'll say, now listen to this. If money is expensive, now what does it mean money is expensive? There's no money. There's no money. See, if I can't find money to be able to buy produce, then you're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan Nehira, I remember, Kad havu kaimin arba sin besela. So he says, I remember when you were able to buy 4 se'in for a sela, v'havin nefichi kapan betveria midles iser. So we'll say, now understand, 4 sa'ah of, let's say, grain for a sela is cheap. It's cheap. But Rabbi Yochanan said, I still remember people walking around with bloated stomachs, right? Bloated stomachs as a result of famine in Tiberia. Why? Midales Isser, because they couldn't find any money. They couldn't find any money. So in other words, having available produce, even available at a cheap rate, if there's no money to be had, you can't buy it. So again, you're allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael for that. Rabbi Yochanan, Nihir Rabbi Yochanan said, I remember, Kad lo haba mitagran pale lemindach karta mereach pita, my son. I remember when workers would not hire themselves out in the east of the city. Why? Because famine was so rampant that in the east they would smell the baking bread, and they would die from the smell. In other words, they were so famished, so hungry, there was nothing to eat, that they wouldn't hire themselves out in the east because they would die of the sense. Rabbi Yochanan says, I remember. Rabbi say this is a positive memory. Rabbi Yochanan says, I remember when Eretz Yisrael was so fertile and Eretz Yisrael was so vibrant that a child would split open a charuv. A charuv is a carob. So I just want to point out, remember, for many of us, carob, right, charuv, it's triggering, right? Because remember, what do you remember? What do you remember about a charuv, right? Tu B'Shvat came, you got like that mystery brown bag, right, that was supposed to be filled with the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. You opened it up, and you're like, wow, like this is what Eretz Yisrael has to offer. Like it did not inspire great feelings of love towards Eretz Yisrael. Besides the numerous, I'm sure I have a strong feeling that in the Jewish community, right, dentists love Tu B'Shvat, right? Because again, there must have been many cracked teeth on that boxer. So we'll say, so if you ever see like real carob in Eretz Yisrael, real carob in Eretz Yisrael is a real fruit. Is a real fruit. So isn't that beautiful this is? So Rabbi Yochanan says, I remember when a child would open up a carob, Batsa Yunuka, Katava Batsa Yunuka Charuva, Vavinogit Chote Deduv Sha'al Trei Dar Ohi. And honey would overflow the sides of the carob. How beautiful that is, right? They'd open up the carob and honey would overflow the sides. One more. Remember Lazar? Lazar says, Nihira, I remember Katava Natal Orva Basra. Listen to this. If a raven would steal a piece of meat, right? The raven would fly for the piece of meat. He deposited it on the wall. V'nagid chutei demishcha meirei shura v'ad la'ara. And the meat would be so fatty in Eretz Yisrael, which was a sign of vibrancy, of health, that the fat of the meat would literally trickle down the wall all the way down to the ground. So we'll say, Rabbi Yochanan having these two different sets of memories. One set of memories after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, where unfortunately there was rampant famine and suffering, and then a secondary memory ultimately again when the Beis Hamikdash stood, about how the land was so incredibly vibrant. Furthermore, Rabbi Yochanan Nehira Katavu Metailin Talya V'Talyasa B'Shuka Kibar Shinis Esrei Kibar Shrev Esrei V'Lo Hava Chatan. And I remember again when the Beis Hamikdash stood, a boy and girl of 16 years old, 17 years old would walk together in the marketplace, and there was no concern with what they would be doing with each other. In other words, that when the Beis Hamikdash stood, there was a sense of moral purity that exists. I will say, which by the way, even though boys and girls interacted, pretty interesting, right? Boys and girls and teenagers interacted, there was no fear of anything negative that was going to occur. And lastly, we'll say now with this we're going to really stop. That they used to say that ultimately, again, whoever goes ahead and admits to the truth of idolatry ultimately will fall into the hands of idolaters, and whoever ultimately, again, puts his faith in them, his possessions will ultimately belong to them. I will say more about that tomorrow. Shkoyach. Great, thank you.